Now you see how you've given the rationale for the federal government intentionally set up a system where they would be able to advocate for the censorship of people that disagreed with the position that they want.
In this specific circumstance, yes.
Let me ask you this, right? Do you think that in addition to the crackdown that we saw on the actual January 6 people, do you think that the federal government, either through NGOs or through institutions like CISA, the FBI, etc., pressured social media to censor conversations about the 2020 election?
Are we talking about like independent media and private platforms, or just overall?
Like social media, do you think, like, because it's undoubtable that places like YouTube, Twitter at the time, Facebook censored people that were saying that the election was stolen, for example. You acknowledge that, correct?
Yeah, I would generally agree with this notion.
Do you think that the government in any direction helped facilitate that, either by the FBI, CISA, other organizations communicating directly with social media, trying to pressure them or offering that they should do this, or through NGOs? Do you think the federal government in those manners pressured social media to do that?
I think to some extent they probably did. I know that certain social media websites work within like government subsidization or have contracts specifically with government organizations. And I think as a result of that, the government sort of pushes them in a direction to try to either censor or uphold the agenda of the individual in question. But I don't think that this intrinsically benefits the left, as we've seen like a sort of shift in this with Elon Musk getting a hold of X, or what was formerly Twitter, becoming a more like traditionally like accepted right-wing values space versus what it was prior to his actually buying of the platform.
Is that because of Elon Musk working with the government to censor people that disagree with government positions?
No, I think this is as a result of Elon Musk being typically a more libertarian or right-wing individual than the previous owners and individuals who ran the platform. I just think it happens to align with what the government wants at the time.
Okay, so to try to steelman your position here, you agree that the government in some form pressured social media to censor people that question the 2020 election, but you say you don't think it's really worth saying that that was something that disaffected the right wing because Elon Musk bought Twitter. And now, not because he's being pressured by the government, nor because he's censoring people, because he's left it more open and is no longer censoring people, it tends to have more of a right-wing bent?
Not necessarily. I think you're misconstruing this a little bit. I'm saying that the government can play a presence in online social media and in privatized platforms. But generally, these privatized platforms usually have their own independent rules and regulations in which they enforce, while there can be a financial incentive for the government to do so, which I think did happen. I'm not saying that you are wrong in that analysis. I'm just saying that these platforms are going to go along with whoever pays them the most. And
Okay,
I think in certain circumstances.
But that's I don't understand how that's responsive to what I'm trying to say here is I'm setting up the point. Okay, so now that we got the point where you're like, yeah, sure, the feds allowed the January 6ers to get into the building so they could crack down on them. And then I'm like, okay, so now that we're at the cracking down on the individual January 6ers, now what about cracking down on the rest of us for free speech? That because of January 6th and the alleged insurrection, they use that as an excuse to pressure social media to be like, hey, you need to censor people that are spreading, quote, disinformation about the election because it could lead to insurrections or it could lead to violence. And you're basically like, yeah, I believe that happened, sure. And so I'm going to be like, yeah, see, once more, pretty fucked up. They're going harder after right-wingers. But you have this equivocation where you're like, well, yeah, but social media will just do whatever. And sure, the government was pressuring them at the time to go after the MAGA people and to censor them. But, you know, Elon came in and now he's letting everyone talk. So come see, come saw. I mean, you don't see the difference there?
Not necessarily. No. It's not necessarily like that. So when you talk about a social media platform being a private platform, they have the right to be able to censor anybody that they desire. And I'm not denying, as I said before, that the government may have influence on this through subsidizations of specific either organizations or contractors who work with that social media. But what I'm saying is, as a result of this specifically happening, there can't be any centralized or overarching system of social media in which can be representative of a government or a governing system, because that's outlined within within the Constitution. I believe that is outlined as being something that is prohibited. And
but they did it, as you admit.
Not necessarily.
But then what do you mean when you say that, yes, it happened? The government pressured social media to censor things not just about this, we also know it about the pandemic. In fact, if you like,
well, okay, so yeah, I was going to say this because like when you talk about freedom of speech and the information that is being pushed out, there isn't necessarily an infringement on freedom of speech in this regard, because freedom of speech does not apply to these privatized platforms, even if the governments are abusing contracts
that's
or
untrue.
contractors,
You're
as I said
incorrect.
before.
You're incorrect.
Can you show me any example in
Yes.
which a privatized platform is required by government law to uphold freedom of speech laws?
It's not that they're
promise
required.
you are
It's not
incorrect.
that they're required to uphold freedom of speech laws. It is illegal for the government to pressure private companies to censor for political reasons speech. I quote to you U.S. District Judge Terry Dowdy, who stated in July 4th, 2023 ruling that the Biden administration's censorship effort, particularly suppressing social media companies to suppress content related to COVID-19 and elections, was, quote, arguably involves the most massive attack against free speech in United States history. Care to respond?
Yeah, I would say that that's probably as a result of an opinion piece, and there are multiple judges that would swing in the opposite direction.
Name
because
me one.
obviously the laws are going to be up to interpretation.
Name me one. Give me a judge that said the opposite.
Sure, I could probably look one up for you here. I'm not specifically familiar with this case.
Mm-hmm. So you're telling me that the federal government, you're not so sure if the federal government's allowed to provide financial incentive or threats to social media to censor posts that are critical of them. You think that that's probably just absolutely fine and it's not against the First Amendment.
If there are privatized platforms, okay, I already acknowledged this, just to be clear. I said that there are certain circumstances where government subsidized organizations or government subsidized systems that are put in place as a result of social media platforms needing or wanting more money to be able to host more users can infringe upon freedom of speech laws as a result of these governments pressuring them to do so. However, in some circumstances, this will not apply, as a freedom of speech on a privatized platform does not apply to the same extent in which it would a government platform. And this is why government platforms for this specific type of thing are not allowed.
Okay, that's not what you said. You're equivocating now. What you said was it wasn't anti-free speech for the government to pressure or incentivize speech that they like, or to pressure speech that they don't like, or incentivize to cancel speech that they don't like, right? Like, that's what you said. That's what happened. That's why the judge that oversaw this case said it was the most massive attack on free speech, because it seemed to be what you're suggesting was this. Let's say the government has a platform that they use, right? By the way, can you name me like a platform the government owns?
Are you talking about a social media
like
platform?
Any sort of platform where people can expound their voice. Can you name me one?
So you're asking me if there are any social media platforms that the government owns?
Correct. Because it seems to be you're saying if they
I'm pretty confident there are none.
Okay. So then if the places we're allowed to speak, social media, through telecommunication, email servers, etc., if the government says, yeah, shut those people up, you don't think that's an attack on free speech?
Again, it depends on the extent in which they are doing it. So like if a government threatens to withdraw subsidiary services to a platform because that platform is not complying with the government's demands, this is an abuse of what that system would be. As a result of that, it is also the private platform's independent and autonomous decision to be able to do or act within those things. There are examples of this all throughout history. Like there are tons of examples of what you would typically call government persuasion in media that's, again, depending on who you ask and what judges are appointed at the time, would be in violation of the First Amendment rights. However, I did decide to look up the court case, and if the one you were referring to is Murphy versus Missouri, there are actually 7 judges on record here that stated that they sided with the Biden administration.
Tell me what they said. They said that if the Biden administration, if they pressured social media to censor, that it's not an attack on free speech. That's what they said?
No, it just says that the dissenting justices in question, and there are a couple of them, had joined specific other justices in the Supreme Court. There were 3 of them, and then there were other judges who sided with the Biden administration.
Okay, so how did the case ultimately get decided?
The case got decided by, I believe it was majority rule vote in the Supreme Court, correct?
Yes, I believe that's the case. And what did they rule? Did they rule this?
They ruled that the Biden administration was guilty.
Okay. So given that, you're just saying you disagree with that ruling?
No, I was giving you examples of how there are justices that would dissent against the opinion which you had previously asked me to state.
Fair enough. And you did state some great. Anyways, the court decision ruled that actually the judge that made that claim that his verdict was correct and was upheld by the Supreme Court, correct?
That is correct.
So then it would seem that your claim that this was an attack on free speech, either A, you disagree with the Supreme Court, or B, you didn't know that the court upheld it.
I would say I would need to look at the circumstances that were out.
You did, in fact, I did ask you to do that, right? But it led the precursor to that, which you were incapable of proving, was this conversation that you acknowledged that there was pressure by the federal government on social media platforms to censor people, particularly conservatives that questioned the election. And you basically tried to equivocate and say, yeah, but social media platforms can do whatever they want. And I said, no, that's a violation of the First Amendment. You disagreed and said, no, show me in the First Amendment, show me in the Constitution where these platforms have to leave you speak. I said, no, I could show you that there is a judge in a court, the case that got ruled, that said this was one of the most significant attacks on the First Amendment because it is against the First Amendment for the government to pressure social media companies to censor free speech. You seem to say that wasn't the case. You seem to suggest, okay, well, the Supreme Court feels that it happened.
Censor free speech.
Sorry, they couldn't hear you there because I brought up the article. I'll run this down real quick. You tell me if I'm inaccurate. You said that there were some judges that disagreed with the judge that I said. However, you acknowledged that the Supreme Court ultimately did decide what the judge I said. I said, well, they heard what I said. And now you're saying, well, actually, no, it's I don't know. You could explain your position there once I said, okay, well, the Supreme Court acknowledged that, yes, actually, this was a violation of the First Amendment and free speech. And you're saying...
Yeah, so I was saying that in the specific circumstance you asked me for proof of dissenting opinions from Supreme Court judges. I was able to find this. You asked me for...
It's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. You're right. I did ask that specifically, but it's irrelevant to the broader context, right? Which is, one, the court actually went the way I said it did. You were able to provide some dissenting judges. But secondly, it doesn't answer the broader question that I asked you, where you seem to suggest that it's perfectly legitimate and not against the free speech or the First Amendment for the federal government to pressure social media to censor Americans. That was your claim, and the Supreme Court's disagreed with you.
The Supreme Court's disagreed with me in this specific case, yes, to the extent at which the censorship happened as a result of government pressure. However, this is not always the case, as there have been other cases throughout the past in which the government has used some level of pressure to actually provide censorship to other privatized platforms, which we have seen with things like Kiwi Farms, 4chan, etc. And as a result of that, it would seem that generally speaking, there is a precedent or an arbitration line in which we decide whether or not this is something that is a violation of the First Amendment or not. And I would say even in this specific circumstance, I don't uphold myself to the rule of law to be higher than the Supreme Court justices of the United States because I'm simply not as well versed and educated as law as them. But I would say that I generally disagree with a lot of the opinions that they propose. And this is one of the circumstances where I would need to see the evidence that was reviewed in the case to be able to decide whether or not that line of arbitration is something I agree or disagree with.
Nonetheless, you could talk about Kiwi Farms and shit like that of cases I don't know, but that's irrelevant to where we're talking about this specific case where you've already conceded that you think the federal government did in fact pressure social media to censor people. So if we look in totality of what you've said, now you just say, I don't know, I'd need to see the evidence. In totality of what you said is the government treats and law enforcement treats right-wingers with kid gloves, but the left riots way worse. The government allowed January 6ers to break in so they could crack down on the people that broke in. Then they pressured social media to censor people that were critical of the 2020 election. The Supreme Court ruled that that was a violation of their First Amendment. You just say, I don't know, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. Nonetheless, regardless of what you think, now you see how you've given the rationale for the federal government intentionally set up a system where they would be able to advocate for the censorship of people that disagreed with the position that they want.
In this specific circumstance, yes. If there, again, like I said, that line of arbitration that exists as like censorship and non-censorship or violation of the First Amendment right is also a problem, though, because this is something that we originally talked about in our first debate that we had in 2021.
I don't remember. Did you ever watch the movie Street Fighter?
Yes, I have.
Do you remember the M. Bison scene? where
I can't say that I
Chun-Li
do.
says, she tells this story. She's like, you bet. Once Bison finds out she's a spy, she's like, you came into my father's village, and it's like this 4-minute story. You came into the village and you raided, and my noble father fought you, and blah 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 blah. And when you went fleeting, you shot him in the back and killed him. And Bison's putting on his, dress shirt and stuff like that. And she keeps going on. It's like 2 minutes, and then she ends, and he goes, "The day that M. Bison came into your life was the most important day in your life, but for me, it was Tuesday. I don't know you. I don't remember our debate we had in 2001 that was on a panel. It was just Tuesday to me. So I'm sorry not to offend you, but I don't remember you. You keep referencing what we talked about. I don't remember it at all."